Hey everybody, Ragnarok here, back with the second video in my two videos about the Yugoslav Attack and the Sicilian Dragon variation. Now, definitely check out the previous video if you haven't already. I played as Black in that game and was able to win with the accelerated dragon. And in this game I played as White and I decided to do the Yugoslav Attack myself. And I think this game does a really good job of explaining the entire I guess opportunities that my opponent missed in the previous video, how to attack my king side. So what I'm going to do is just go over this game where I am White in the Yugoslav Attack. So the Yugoslav Attack is against the Sicilians, so it's going to start off with e4 and then c5 with my opponent playing that. This is the Sicilian, which is standard. My next move is going to be knight to f3, just trying to attack in the center, try to eventually push this d4 pawn. Same idea. He plays d6 just like I did in the last game, preventing my pawn from going forward, because let's say if his knight decided to come out, I can kind of start to bully that knight around if I'd like to at some point, and it really just creates a weakness where eventually I can push that knight away. So he goes here to prevent that. I go to d4. He takes, c takes on d4, knight takes on d4, and then instead of the accelerated dragon, which would have been g6, instead, he actually goes for just, I believe it's just standard dragon, where he's going to bring this knight up. Again, I can't push this pawn because the pawn is there to defend it. So next, I bring my knight out to protect the e4 pawn. He goes for the dragon variation, and when you do this, you kind of automatically assume your opponent's next move is going to be bringing that bishop to g7, finalizing the fianchetto on the king side. So I initiate the Yugoslav attack with bishop goes to e3. Bishop does indeed go to g6, and here's that mistake I talked about in the last video where he could have absolutely just played his knight right here. I made a mistake. I just kind of played it a little bit too quickly. I should have probably pushed f3 first, but I guess you can kind of see it many ways. Not every opponent is going to bring their knight onto g4. It's just something to think about. It's kind of taking away the attack of this bishop, because let's say that the knight does come here after my queen comes in, you know, I really don't have a good square for it to go to. I can bring it up to g5 if I'd like. It's not really going to do anything there, and then I guess I can kind of push this knight away with either f3 or h3, but in general, this isn't the position that I want to go for, so I probably should have pushed f3 first. But if we go back to the game itself, he actually didn't push that. He ended up castling instead, and then I go f3, preventing that knight from coming back in. Now he brings his knight to c6. I bring my bishop to c4 with my attack on the f7 square, and he brings bishop over to d2. So a slight variation. That's the only difference about this game compared to the last game. In my game, I first brought my knight over to e5 with the tempo on the bishop had to come back. So instead of him doing that, he opts to bring his bishop off the back rank with the rook idea coming to attack on the c file. So yeah, no immediate need for me to move my bishop. I just castle, get my king to safety. Something I guess to think about is when you are castled here, this bishop could potentially come here on this file with an attack on the queen, pinning it against the king. It's not an immediate threat. It's just something to think about down the line, depending on what moves happen next. You could have that idea. Let's say you did have this pawn was here. I'm just going to do some bad moves, for example. Let's just say this is out of sync because some trades happened in the center. This king could protect the bishop, and then you could have that pin there. Of course, this is obviously stopped at this point, but I just want to let you know that the idea is there in the back of people's minds. So going back to the position we were in, I just castled. He brought his rook on the same file as my king, which is a very good idea. So just preventing any discovery attacks, because he could easily take this knight. The threat here, if I take back with bishop, I'll drop my bishop. So just to prevent that idea, I bring my bishop back to the b3 square, which is really where it wants to be, because it's going to protect this pawn if the queen decides to come out here and attack it. It's also going to protect the c2 square in front of my king. So his knight comes out here, so instead of going for having the centralized knight, which I kind of like in the Sicilian Dragon, because you've got some discover attacks with this bishop on the long file, or long diagonal, he instead goes and says, I want to take this bishop. And at this point, this bishop can't be saved. And not that it's going to be lost, but it's opening up my king, potentially, as you'll see in a second. but he's kind of forcing me to have this go away. So I decide it's going to happen anyway. He's kind of wasted 1, 2, 3 moves for his knight to trade for my bishop. That's moved the same amount of times, but I'm going to go ahead and continue my attack, or begin my attack on the king side, which always is going to start with the h4 push. So now he ends up taking, because that's why his knight moved out there. Check on my king, so I have to take back. I take back with the bishop. Take back with the knight. So the knight is going to be good here. Both of these knights are going to control 4 squares in front of them, so kind of preventing the queen from coming out here, preventing anything really from any pawns from being pushed immediately, which is good. And at the same time, I've got this bishop with a nice attack on this diagonal if I'd like. Now, if I were to take, let's just say he goes here and I take, he'll trap my bishop. So I don't want to do that right away. But the idea is there. So yeah, I bring my knight back to here, which does kind of open up his attack on my king side because my knight's out of the way. His knight was never in the center. So I decide, or he decides to move his bishop up here and says, I really want that knight. That's what he's saying. He doesn't want anything to occupy this square, and he knows that now, if he does take on his next move, I'm going to have to either undouble my pawn, or double up my pawns and open up my king, or open up my the complete A file, allowing the queen to come in here with a potential checkmate if this knight is not here to defend. So I decide, go ahead, take my piece. I'm going to continue my attack, and this is the main goal of the Yugoslav attack. So this knight's really not super important. This knight could definitely do some damage later on, but these queen, let me just clear that up. Queen and bishop are again attacking on this file diagonal here, the dark diagonal. All these pawns are able to push forward and really weaken that fianchettoed king side. So I'm starting the attack here. He hasn't pushed the h5 square yet anyway, which is really allowing my next move to push up to h5 first. But first he's going to take with the bishop. I take back, A takes bishop. Queen comes here. Now, I don't necessarily have to block because it's not checkmate next move, but just to be safe, I move my king here. It's always a nice idea because it's off the file of the rook, meaning that, you know, maybe I don't want this knight to be pinned later on. And at the same time, if, let's just say I did something else and I allow here, it's kind of like my knight goes back to its starting spot. And it's really not going to help out because the knight really wants to be in the center again, potentially attacking the e2 pawn, which is pretty weak in the Sicilian dragon. So it is a target that you do want to go after. Yeah, that's not really good. Yeah, his queen's kind of stuck here, but you know, potentially all he has to do is this, and he's got a nice attack here, threatening checkmate, and then this rook is here. So it's a lot going on. I really just want to avoid that if I can completely. So I go back to king goes to b1 instead. Now he does decide now to push the h5 pawn. I think it would have been better if the g pawn weren't there, because my goal is to open up both the g and h files if I can. So I take back because now I can bring this rook over or this rook over and have this file with the king. And if he takes back with the pawn, then I have achieved that open file, and my rooks can occupy it. His are just kind of stuck back here. So he ends up taking with the knight, and I decide to go for the main idea, the Yugoslav, which is getting that bishop there. It's not, you know, main idea, threat, whatever you want to call it. He doesn't have to take. Again, he could have done something else. Maybe bring this rook up here, get both rooks on the same file, potentially trading off here. But he decides to take back, which allows my queen to come in here with some potential threats. Now he does bring the rook up, threatening to bring the rook on the a6, queen eventually checkmating on the a2 square. And if he gets his rook here, it's not quite checkmate. It's not quite unpreventable because I can bring my knight over here. You know, you can still do it, potentially push this pawn, but it's not really a huge threat because if we, let's just say I do something else, and then I do something else, let's just say, I mean, it's not a huge threat right away. There's a lot of moves that had to happen for that to go there, and then I can just move here, and I get out. So it's not a huge threat. There are a lot of things I would lose material, but he has to do that quicker than I can do my attack, and he just doesn't have the chance in this game. So the knight takes here. Again, queen ends up taking the bishop. on h6. So yeah, his king now has no squares that he can go to, so all I really have to do is check him. And again, let's think about where I can check him on that e2 square. So yes, he does that rook move. Again, it's not really a threat just yet. I decide to come in here, because if his rook comes there, I'm threatening checkmate at this point. And he can prevent it in two ways. He can bring his rook here, he can bring his queen back here. His rook goes here, I would just take it with the knight, so that's not a possibility. I guess he can move this pawn if he wants, but I would still come in here with a double fork, or double attack with my fork on the rook as well as the king. So not a good idea for him to do that, so he prevents it with queen going to d8, preventing that check. And let me know if you guys see what the next move should be. For me, I decided to go to rook on the h side, because I like having this rook here. Who knows if it's gonna, this file is gonna open up or not, but it's always a good idea to keep your rooks or bishops on the same file or diagonal as the queen if you can. So I decided to go with this one because I really don't see this pawn moving anyway, so this rook's not gonna do anything in the game as well, so that's why I wanted to move this one. And it's also threatening me taking this knight here. So he does make a mistake. I guess he kind of just wants to kick my knight away, but my next move is to take the knight. He takes back to try to stay even in material, and let me know if you guys see the tactic here. It's actually a forced mate in, well, was it forced? I believe it's about 6 moves, if you guys can see it. At least see the main idea, if you can see the first move here. It's white to play. Alright, so the next move I do is a rook sack on rook takes g6. Now his king has no squares, if you remember, so I found a way to check him that wasn't the knight. The knight was really a distraction to bring his queen back and kind of prevent that checkmate idea on the a1 square. Now, takes back here. So this is, if we go back, let's count the moves. This was move 1, move 2, king is forced to go to the h square. Move 3, king is forced to go back. Check. Check with the rook, so that's move 4. Move 5. And he actually resigned at this point, but let's finish it. I believe it's 2 more moves. King has to go here. Rook, queen goes to e6, check. All the squares are taken up. Queen must block, and then checkmate. So yeah, that is the main idea of the Yugoslav, and you can see why it's so lethal if we just go back a few moves. This whole pawn structure right here, you really want to try to block with h5 if you can right away, because all of these pawns, queen and bishop, are all on the same really trajectory. These rook coming down here, this rook coming down here, so much happening that you really want to be wary of. So if you can execute your attack like I did in the previous game on the queen side, just try to do it quicker than your opponent can. It becomes a race of queen side versus king side, so try not to waste any moves. Like my opponent wasted a few here, taking some pieces, trying to eliminate my defenders, but this was just really tough for him to break. There's too much going on here. This bishop was never opened up. Actually, it was traded over there. So I was able to execute my plan quicker. So keep that in mind. If you see the accelerated, hyper accelerated, or the regular dragon, you can always try the Yugoslav attack. It's a really, really strong attack, as you guys saw. But of course, you have to execute your plan. If you don't, black can win like I did in the last game. So hopefully you guys enjoyed these 2 videos. If you'd like to see more Yugoslav attack or accelerated dragon, I do play it a lot and I practice it a lot, so I've got plenty more games if you guys would like to see them. So thank you so much, guys. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already. Go check out ragchess.com, short for Ragnarok Chess, where I discuss principles. I'm starting to go over some games in depth, kind of like I'm doing on these videos as well, but more so the theory behind them as well. So keep your eye out for those in the future. Thanks so much, guys. I will see you in the next video.